It's a great honor and a privilege to introduce Charles Gilmore. We're here in your beautiful home in Yerushalayim. And Charles, if you could tell us a little bit about your family and your history, growing up in England and coming to live in Israel.
Sure. I was born Charles Goldman in 1936, and my father had come from Poland, a place called Ozakov, in about probably 1899, 1900, and his other family also came about the same time. He had two brothers and I think four sisters, and they all had education in London. He went to a school called Chicksound Street School. He said it was a high school. What he meant was they played football on the roof. They grew up in the East End of London, and at a certain point in their lives they decided to get out of the East End of London and they went to live in Southend. And in fact, Southend is next to Westcliff in the same way as in England Brighton is next to Hove, and I was born in Westcliff. In about the year, what can I say, probably 1941, they moved to a town called Brighton, which is a seaside town in England, which in fact was in a very dangerous position because during the attack by the Germans in the Battle of Britain, there was a fear that Hitler was trying to invade England, and Brighton was on the south coast, and that would be actually in the front line. The time that he went there, of course, the Blitz had finished. The main Blitz was in London in 1940-41. We moved to Brighton in 1941, and I went to school there, to the ordinary primary school in the middle of Brighton, where we had a class of 40 children, and 4 of us were Jewish. Only 4. It was an ordinary middle of the city centre ordinary what was called primary school.
Can I ask, did you grow up in a religious home or traditional home?
I grew up in a home which is, I think, quite common. That is, my father would never dream of allowing me to put the lights on Shabbat. I went to shul every Friday night and Shabbat morning, not during the week, with my cousin, who was called Helen, who is 89, living in London at the moment. And and our kashrut was absolutely was firm. In other words, the family almost had a psychological feeling about kashrut. Nobody would ever dream of eating anything that was not kosher. And in Brighton in those days, it was a small town with quite a considerable Jewish population. It had 3 Orthodox shuls, one in Brighton, one in the adjoining Hove. Brighton and Hove were 2 towns together, and then later on it also acquired one further out. On Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, it was so busy that there were usually, at least in the main shul, there were 2 overflow services. The position today is that the main shul, called Middle Street, which is architecturally beautiful, there's actually a picture over there of it, which is a beautiful shul. In these days, in fact, it can't get a minyan, so it doesn't operate as a shul anymore.
This is the shul?
That's the shul, yeah.
Can you speak a little bit about your mother? Where did your mother come
yes.
from?
My mother's family came from Russia, I think from a place called Pinsk. She had only sisters. She had only sisters. I think she had 5 sisters, and they all grew up, all started off in the East End of London, and then subsequently, years later, they moved to an area called Bronsbury Park, which was the smart area of London for the Jews who were moving on. And they also went to school in London at school. There were no Jewish schools then, apart from the East End of London, where there was the the Jews' free school. and the Jews Free School was only in the East End. So if you didn't live in the East End, you usually didn't go to the Jews Free School. The interesting thing about the Jews Free School is that the headmaster, and the original headmaster, Mr. Angel, wouldn't allow the children to speak Yiddish because he said he was teaching the boys to become English gentlemen.
So you have a most beautiful picture of the...
Yeah, you want me to hold this?
And you remember the shawl? You remember?
Very much, yes.
Do they have a minyan over the Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur?
No, all week. A million every...
No.
No, they don't have it at all. Not at all.
Is it?
Well, the community's moved out largely. It's moved out to a different area, and a lot of the next generation have moved away. I mean, for example, I've moved away. Some of my friends are living in Israel. Other of my friends are living in America. So the next generation began to move away. So my mother's family then, they were mainly, they originated in the East End, and they moved to Bronsbury Park. And so I had a number of aunts who were all very, very nice to me and used to send me birthday presents.
Do you know how your parents met?
I don't know how they met. I understand that they met by arrangement, and once I think my father had lost interest, and my grandfather approached him and said, you know, what about it? So that was how it was. I have no idea exactly how they met. They actually, to tell you the truth, they were not a very good match as a marriage. They didn't get on with each other. They didn't see things in the same way, and they had, and life was in fact not too easy because they didn't get on with each other.
But they stayed married?
Oh, they stayed married, yes, because in those days, in the 1940s in England, getting divorced was quite a problem. I mean, there were two aspects. One was the actual legal side of getting a divorce was complicated because you could actually go to court. You had to go to court to get a divorce, and when you went to court, you could have a trial. You had to prove certain things. You either had to prove adultery or cruelty, and the cruelty then was not even psychological cruelty. It had to be physical cruelty. And you could have a case which went on for several days, and at the end of it the judge would say, I'm not satisfied. So people were very reluctant to get involved. In addition to that was another problem, and that was that these people, I mean my father and so on in those days, in the early days, they weren't earning enough money to be able to pay out substantial alimony to their wives. And the wives on the holiday, my mother hardly ever really worked. She worked for a short time during the Second World War, but she hardly ever worked. So women in those days didn't work, they weren't earning money, and if you wanted to actually break up the marriage, there were financial difficulties. But in fact, they carried on together, and as I say, we started in wherever it was. We moved there in 1941, and the war was on at the time. And the war was the main thing in our minds. And I remember very clearly, sometimes, I tell you, how did we live? We lived in a flat, in an apartment, and the situation there was that we had a front room, as we called it, a bedroom, and a kitchen, and a bathroom. No hot water, we didn't have a phone, and we didn't actually have a radio. So I slept usually on a divan in the front room, and a friend of ours years later asked me about this, and she said, didn't you find it terrible living like that? And I said, no, not really. There were friends of ours who were living in similar situations, and the war was going on, and we were worried about the war, and those were the big issues in our minds. And she said to me, Charlie, she said, I think you're in denial. I wasn't in denial. It wasn't the issue of exactly how, that was what we knew. Like lots of people, I mean, Selig Prodetsky, I think, lived in a very tiny, remember the mathematician, lived in a tiny place in the East End with all his brothers and sisters. It didn't worry him,
Do you have any siblings?
Any
siblings?
No.
You were the only child?
Well, what we found is that a lot of our contemporaries were only children, because once the war came, people didn't have any more children. They stopped.
And can I ask, looking back, are you happy that your parents stayed together?
I don't know. I don't know, because I don't know what the consequence would have been if they hadn't. It's difficult, impossible to know.
But you grew up in a relatively happy home?
Well, there was a lot of conflict going on. That was the issue, actually. That was the thing that was difficult in my life. The difficulty wasn't the fact that we were living during a war and that we were frightened of what would happen and that there were bombs and so on. That wasn't the issue. The issue was that the home life was a bit uncomfortable. On the other hand, living in the same road was my uncle and one of my aunts and my cousin, who I was very friendly with. And what we used to do sometimes was, in order to hear the radio, after we'd had supper, my father and I would go down the road to my uncle's house and we would listen to the radio. And I can remember very clearly listening to the radio and hearing Winston Churchill. And ever since then, Winston Churchill has been one of my... I've got two particular obsessions. I got other obsessions as well, two particular ones. One obsession is Winston Churchill, and the other one is Winnie the Pooh. So anyway, so when we were young, we were at school. We walked to school, which was in the middle of the town, and every now and again there would be an air raid. And when there was an air raid, we all had to leave the classrooms, and we went into a shelter which was built in the school, and we sat there inventing stories to keep the time going.
And at school, did you make friends with the other kids?
Hardly. No, not really, no.
Was there any anti-Semitism? Did you feel any negativity that you were Jewish, or did the other kids know that you were Jewish?
Yes, of course they knew we were Jewish. Yes, of course we did, because we didn't go into prayers, and every now and again there would be a remark, and they knew in fact that we'd killed Jesus Christ, so they would make odd remarks like that. That would happen. Yeah, there was anti-Semitism. There was an atmosphere of anti-Semitism. It actually particularly expressed itself on the day that the news came out of the two British soldiers who'd been hanged by the Irgun. And funnily enough, somebody else also experienced unpleasantness on that day, and that was Yehuda Avner, who used to be the special advisor to the Prime Ministers.
I knew you.
And I knew Yehuda Avner because I met him when I was at a B'nai Akiva camp years later, and he was a shaliach, and he was a madrik at the camp, and his name was Gubi Hafner from Manchester. So, and he, in his book, in the Prime Ministers, he gives his experience of what happened on that day. And we didn't have as bad an experience as that, but we did have sort of various remarks that were made that were unpleasant.
And can I ask, during this time when you were at school, did you know anything about the Holocaust, the Shoah, what was going on with the Jews in Europe?
We didn't know during the war, no. It came out after the war.
But during the war, did you discuss
really
at home, or did you...
They didn't really know much. I mean, there was a big thing about the anti-Semitism, about Hitler, and what Hitler's plans were, but a lot of what had gone on in Auschwitz and so on, people didn't really know until after the war. And after the war there was a book which came out written by somebody called Lord Russell of Liverpool called The Scourge of the Swastika, which was the first time we really had a lot of detail about what had been going on. I've actually got a copy here.
Did your parents have any family members that were...
Not as far as I'm aware. We were amongst those families who... there are lots of families who did have, but as far as I'm aware, I'm not aware of it. Now, the sadness actually is this, now I'm talking to you, is that I never actually discussed with my father anything to do with his background. We never discussed it. He never talked about it. And now I say to myself, if I'd known, I would have asked him, and he would have told me things.
And he never told you stories about...
Nothing. We lived in a bubble.
And what about grandparents, or...
grandparents. We called her Bubba, and she was my father's mother, but she died when I was 3. So I remember her.
You still?
But I don't remember much about her. I just remember her. His father died in 1942, and I used to visit him because one of my father's sisters lived in Stoke Newington, and once a year I would go with my father from Brighton to London, and we would get on a bus, and we would go to the East End, and we might have a salt beef sandwich in Bloom's, and then we would go on to see his sister. And my grandfather was living with her, but I think his English was very, very poor, and I can't remember ever having had a conversation with him. I just met him. But the problem there was that there was food rationing in those days, and she actually put herself out specially to give me a soft-boiled egg, and I hated soft-boiled eggs. So that's the ground on that side. On the other side, my mother's father, I remember, because I remember staying in their house in Bronsbury Park and going to shul with him on a Shabbat morning. But he died in 1944, I think. So I'd only see him when we went to London, because Brighton was 50 miles away, and we would only go there especially on a visit. So I didn't know much about him, but I do remember him quite clearly. And I remember being at a Seder with him, and I think he's making the charoset. Now, on the other hand, his wife I knew very well, because she survived him and lived until 1966. And I often used to stay with her, and she was actually at our wedding. She was very, very deaf, and that was a terrific struggle for her, because she loved to read. She was very thoughtful, very intelligent, but a very sort of hard personality. So I got to know her, and every now and again, when I was older, I used to stay with her in her flat. Originally, she lived in a very nice house in Bronsbury Park, and then after he died, they sold the house, and she moved into an apartment which was not nearly as luxurious. I mean, what the financial position was, I don't know. She obviously had enough money to live on.
And can I ask, during the war, do you remember, with the food rationing, I
remember food rationing very clearly.
Did you go hungry? Did you ever?
Because we used to get D coupons and E coupons for sweets, and when we wanted to buy sweets, we had to produce our coupons to get them. Food was rationed, bread was rationed. I mean, everything was rationed, and you just had everybody had a ration book. Every family had a ration book, which they used, and that was that presented its problems. I mean, you had to be very careful what you ate, unless somebody knew somebody who knew somebody. And we didn't seem to know somebody who knew somebody, but some people did. I believe that my wife's father knew somebody who was a farmer, and he used to get eggs from him, that sort of thing. But the main concern during the war was what was going on, the news about the battles, the constant air raids, air raid warnings, which we were living with. We got used to it, but we were living with it, and it made life very, very difficult. You had to be careful. We all had blackouts on our windows, so that all the windows were covered up because of the bombs. And in fact, my father was in what's called the Home Guard. He was too old to be in the army. He was in the Home Guard, and my uncle was what was called an air raid warden, an ARP, air raid warden, and he used to go out at night watching in case things happened. I'm not sure what he was supposed to do. I think it's supposed to make sure that people had their windows covered up, as far as I could see. I don't know. So throughout the years of the war, we were constantly aware. I mean, we used to get, the newspaper came every morning, and we were constantly aware what was going on. And as I say, often in the evening I used to walk along with my father to my uncle's house, and we listened to the radio to see what the news was. And when the war came to an end, I remember wondering what the newspapers would write about. If there's no war, I thought, what is there to write about?
And you remember V-Day? You remember the...
I remember VE Day,
VE Day.
The end of the European War. I mean, very, very clearly. I remember going to the centre of the town and seeing all the crowds around the middle of the town called the Clock Tower. And I remember it very, very clearly, yes. I remember exactly. And after VE Day, of course, what happened was on the beach at Brighton, there was, you couldn't go on the beach. And there was barbed wire all the way along, you could never go. And once it was VE Day, they took the barbed wire away, and everybody went onto the beach. That was the celebration. But of course, the war hadn't ended then, because there was VJ Day to come, when the Japanese were finished. And I remember the atomic bomb. And of course, now everybody says, I mean, what would happen today if you dropped an atomic bomb? You'd have 3,000 people in America complaining, wouldn't you?
More than 3,000.
Yeah, they're complaining now that it was wrong. But a lot of the laws now against it were not in place then. They came out after the Second World War. So really, I didn't have such a bad time. I can't say it was a bad time. It was worrying because it was a bit frightening. And I remember walking home from school once, and there was an air raid, and somebody rushed me into their house to avoid it.
Were any of the buildings damaged with the air raids?
Sorry?
Were any of the buildings damaged?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Where we lived, our windows were blown out one night. A bomb dropped nearby, and once they dropped a bomb on one of the children's clinics, and people got killed and injured. But Brighton wasn't a main place for bombing, because it wasn't an industrial centre. They used to bomb the industrial centres and the ports. But there was an occasion, which actually is vaguely amusing, where near where we lived there was an old church called St Nicholas Church, which I think was 11th or 12th century church, and it was surrounded by a cemetery, and it was full of tombstones. And one day a German plane got shot down and it crashed into the cemetery, and the result was it affected a lot of the tombs, that they were all on the angle. And years later, when I was at school, we were doing woodwork, and I'm completely unartistic and completely useless at woodwork, and usually in woodwork I was looking most of the time for my piece of wood from the last time, not to do anything, but we had to make a toast rack, and I made a toast rack. And when the family looked at it, they said it's like what happened in the cemetery when the plane came down. So that was the local plane and the local cemetery.
And Charles, can I ask, when did the war had finished, but when did did the news filter in of what had happened to the Yidden, the Jews in the...
It came out after, as I say, with the scourge of the swastika, it came out. But there was an important news broadcast by Richard Dimbleby, who visited Belsen, and he made a broadcast of what he saw, so we knew about that. And apparently the story about it is that he told the BBC he had this report to make, and they didn't want him to make it, and he threatened to resign if he didn't make it. And in the end, they edited what he said. But you can still get it, actually. I think if you Google Richard Dimbleby, Belsen, I think you can still get his report of what he saw at Belsen. So once he did that, we began to know, but we didn't know how much. We didn't know how extensive it had been.
And did you ever see newsreels?
Yes.
In the cinemas, or?
Yes, we saw newsreels, because you went to the cinema and you went to see a film, and there was always a newsreel, a news with it. And there were newsreels of some of the things that had happened in the concentration camps. We were horrified. I mean, my uncle was horrified by it, but what could we do?
And did you ever meet, when you were growing up in Brighton, were there any Kindertransport children that came from Europe that were in Brighton as well?
Well, I think what happened was this. When we were at Hebrew classes, I remember we had some refugees, and they must have been Kindertransport, and we had hardly any communication with them, because they hardly spoke English. That must have been in about 1941, 42. I think that was all. The only other later in our life, we came across people who we knew who had been either hidden or had probably had been hidden. And there was one particular friend of ours who is not alive now, who I always called the acceptable face of Frumkeit, because he behaved like a mensch, and he was frum, but he was frum in a sensible way. He was called Yannick, and apparently he was stowed out of, which ghetto was it? What were the ghettos? I forgot.
In Poland?
Sorry?
In Poland?
In Poland.
Lodz?
Not Lodz, no.
Warsaw?
No.
Krakow?
Krakow, that's right. He was stowed out of Krakow at the age of about 7 or 8 in a suitcase, and he was taken and stayed with non-Jews for the rest of the war, and he was kept in an attic in the top room, and the only time he saw anybody was when they brought him a meal once a day. And when we knew him, we had no idea about this, because he just behaved like an ordinary, normal, decent person. And I remember saying to him, how did you cope? And he said, well, I didn't know anything else.
And did he have any bitterness in him or any...
No, he was very, very... He ran a decent life. I mean, he didn't have any time for the Nazis, of course. But he ran his life in a normal way, and his widow now is living in Jerusalem, in a Beit Havot in Uziel, and his children, he's got children, 3 children. One of them has gone Hasidic, and I had an amusing experience when we used to go to the same shul in London, called Bridge Lane Beis HaMidrash, which where I consider myself one of the progressive members. And even though I was one of the progressive members, at one stage, I don't know if you're interested in this, at one stage in my membership, the father of the Rav, who was a representative of the shul at the Board of Deputies. And he came to me and he said, I'll be 80 soon, I think I've got to retire, I think it would be very suitable if you would represent the shul at the Board of Deputies. So I regarded that as flattery, I regarded it as an enormous compliment, and I said yes. So for a number of years I represented this shul, which his line of Frumkeit was a bit different from mine, at the Board of Deputies. And there was an occasion when I was there, and they said the president was attacked for not having Hasidism or Haredim in the Board of Deputies represented, because the Haredim wouldn't be representative, they would have nothing to do with it. And he said, but we've got Bridge Lane here. So I got up and I said, Bridge Lane is not Haredi, it's a broad church.
And it was accepted, or people were upset with their comment?
Yeah, well, no, that's okay. It's all right, it's all right. Understood the point. And I told the Rav at a later stage about that. I had another occasion, which has nothing to do with the suffering in the Second World War. I always tell this story because it's true. I'm a great, I should say that I am a great believer in a rabbi called Rabbi Louis Jacobs, who in 1957 wrote a book called We Have Reason to Believe.
It was the whole Jacobs affair.
That's right, in which he explained that in fact there is a thing called biblical criticism, and there's certain clear evidence that a lot of what's in the Chumash could not have actually come written by Moshe Rabbeinu, and he got into trouble over that. But today it's different, because today there are a lot of Orthodox academics who in fact realise that, in my opinion, realise that's correct, including the Rafi Zaram that I mentioned to you earlier, who's the dean of this London School of Jewish Studies, And so I've been a great believer in that, and that actually has kept me within my Judaism, because the people who write and say, there was a Diane Herman who wrote to me when I wrote to him once, and he wrote, and he said, I asked him who wrote the Chumash, and he said it was all dictated, every single word, by HaKadosh Baruch Hu to Moses, right? Well, I could never accept that. So I've always had this sort of attitude. Now, there was an occasion when Rabbi Jacobs was attending a shul, a United Synagogue shul in England, where his granddaughter was going to get married, and he was there on a Shabbat morning. And somebody communicated with the London Bet Din before as to whether he should be called up or not. And they didn't call him up. And that was regarded as an enormous insult, and there was a lot of publicity about it. And after that, it was discussed apparently publicly, all sorts of things, including the Board of Deputies. And I was at an AGM of my shul when Rabbi Weingarten's father, who had been the representative, I had just been elected to be the representative, and the father had made a statement. He said, we discussed this particular issue at the Board of Deputies, and I think the United Synagogue made the right decision. So I thought to myself, I may be the representative of the Board of Deputies, but I'm a member of this shul, but I can't accept that. So I stood up and I said, I think you should know that this week I went to the National Theatre and I saw a play called The Life of Galileo, and it took the Roman Catholic Church 350 years to admit he was right. And then I sat down, and afterwards Mr. Weingarten was crossing the road to go to his car, and I went up to him and I said to him, you know, I'm sorry, I just had to say that. And he said to me, oh, don't worry, old boy. He said, I've just got blind faith. And I thought that was quite a nice experience. So what do you want to know about what happened to me?
So
I went to the primary school until the age of 11. I didn't go into prayers, and during prayers often I used to go to the headmaster's study. Now in those days the kids used to bring their dinner money every day. I mean, I didn't have dinner there because it wasn't kosher. I used to go home every day during the lunch hour and come back again. So I used to produce the money every day. So every morning he had all the money on his desk, usually in coins, and I would go into his room and he would count all the coins out, put them in bags, and then give to me to go outside the school and cross the road to the newsagent to get it turned into paper money. And I thought to myself recently, can you imagine today giving a 10-year-old child a bag of money to cross the road to go to a shop? You wouldn't do it. Too dangerous. So that's what used to happen during prayers. But there was an occasion when they had a Christmas play, and I was in it. I was Father Christmas.
And did you used to play sports? Was sports a big...
I loved football, and I always used to play football. And when I used to have a friend, a non-Jewish friend who lived down the road from me, and we often used to go off onto the recreation ground and play football. But from the age of, 1947, I think was the first time they began professional football again after the war. And on a Christmas day, my father took me to a football match, and a local professional team, and my team lost 6-1 at home. And I said to my grandchildren, I said, you know, after that experience, you can cope with anything. And after that, I was always interested in the football, and we used to follow it. We used to follow the football and play. And
who did you support?
Brighton and Hove Albion, of course. Brighton, who are now in the Premier League. They weren't then. They were then in what was called the Third Division South, and they used to come bottom, and they used to have to seek re-election every year in those days. Because in those days, because of travel is now easier. In those days, there was the First Division, there was the Second Division, and then was the Third Division South and the Third Division North, so that the players in the South didn't have to travel so far across the country. And that's the way it worked.
And Charles, can I ask, during this time in 1947, we have the British white paper. Well, the white paper came, and there was the restrictions on Aliyah, on people wanting,
Yes, yes.
even the survivors from
Yes.
Shona, that the those that had survived the terrible, horrendous atrocities, who wanted to go into home to Palestine,
Yes, yes.
to the Jewish home, and they were forbidden, and they were caught in.
We were very aware of it.
Was
My
this-
father was very, very concerned about it. He used to keep cuttings upon cuttings upon cuttings from newspapers, and there was a foreign minister in the Labour government called Ernest Bevin, who was hated because he was the one who formulated the foreign policy which restricted the entry of Jews into Palestine in those days. We were very much aware of it and very, very concerned about it and very upset about it.
So, did it make you feel, being a British citizen, being born in England, and knowing that there were British Army, and there was the Irgun, and there was the raids?
It didn't make you anti-British, actually. It just made you anti the government. It didn't make you anti-British. You wanted, in order to be able to get on in life in those days, you had to sort of become English, and you had to speak like the English, and you had to behave like the English. But what you did know was that, we experienced a bit of anti-Semitism at school. You got odd remarks, which you were quite used to, and you just knew it. You knew it was there.
Do you remember the bombing at the King David, when the King David Hotel?
Yeah, I remember all those. Events.
And were the repercussions at home, or did you feel any repercussions when the news broke there?
Yes, absolutely. I gave you the example of the two soldiers who were hanged. What happened then? The King David. Of course, there were repercussions. The people would make remarks to you.
Those that were hanged. It was also that the British had captured a lot of Jewish underground, and had also.
That wasn't the point. That wasn't what the British were concerned about. They were concerned about what happened to their people, not what happened to the Jews, because they didn't like the Jews very much. And we've discovered now, haven't we, how much people don't like the Jews very much.
There's here in Rehabia, they even have a sign where a youngster was picked up by the British, and he never came home.
Yes.
His body was never found.
Yeah, we know about all those. We were aware of those things that were going on. There was nothing we could do about it. We just were upset.
And do you remember the partition plan?
Yes, of course, 1947. Yeah, very much so, yes.
And the Declaration of Independence?
Now, the interesting thing about it is this, that Ava was a year younger than me, and she really doesn't remember very much about the whole thing. I'm not sure why. It may be that she was living in... she went to a school from Methodist ministers' daughters, and she was living in Southport, which didn't really suffer from the war. They didn't have air raids, so she wasn't very much aware of it. We were aware of everything. We were watching things all the time, and we were concerned all the time, and we were anxious. I remember actually. I'm not sure if this is correct. I think that I heard on the radio the broadcast of the voting on the plan, on the independence,
the partition.
On the partition, yeah. I think I heard it. With the majority.
And when the state was declared, when Ben Gurion declared the state?
Of course, we remembered that very much, of course. We had a newspaper which still published, but with them, everybody used to have the Jewish Chronicle. Now, everybody read the Jewish Chronicle.
It's the oldest Jewish newspaper, it says.
Everybody. Now they don't, because now you've got the what I call the strictly Orthodox, who've got their own newspaper, and as well as that, now everybody looks on their phones, so it's a different sort of thing. But in those days, the Friday morning was very important because that's when the Jewish Chronicle came out.
And did you belong to were there any youth movements?
B'nai Akiva.
And there was in Brighton a youth B'nai Akiva?
In Brighton was B'nai Akiva. And when I reached the age of about 14, I think it was, we were able to go to B'nai Akiva camps in the summer. And in fact, there are still some friends that I met at B'nai Akiva camps who I meet here now, who are living here now. And that was a terrific experience, because when you were living in Brighton, it was a very limited existence. The actual Orthodox community was very limited. There were three shuls. There was a Reform shul, and there was also a liberal synagogue. The Though the point was that in those days, most Jews, whether they were Orthodox or not, they went to the Orthodox synagogue. If they were going to synagogue, they went to the Orthodox. That was what everybody did. And it was only the marginal ones who'd go to Sunday night reform. So there were these 3 synagogues, and we were all familiar with them, and we went to them, and that was the community. But it was only a small proportion of the people who went there who were actually really frum. I remember, in fact, when I was tried for mitzvah, we were actually paid money in order to make up the minyan. And my friend, Michael Kaplan, during Mariv in the summer, who was there being paid also to be there, was reading the stop press in the newspaper to see what the cricket results were.
He helped make the minyan.
Yeah, he made the minyan, he was there.
And when did you decide you wanted to study further? To study further and to go to university?
Well, when I was at school, it was a thing which was regarded as automatically something you would do when the time came, if you could. And I'm not sure whether it's fed into me or not, but the idea of becoming a lawyer was a good idea. And because of what I told you about the family background, I was rather interested in dealing with divorce, which I then actually, for quite a number of years, specialised in. I then gave it up. And then, as I got older, I found that I couldn't really deal with it because I was dealing with younger people, and it was the wrong generation. You can't get in their minds.
And where did you study law?
I studied at London University, King's College. What you do is in England, you could do it in 2 different ways. You can either leave school at 16 and go into a solicitor's office and be with him for 5 years and take a few exams, and then when you're 21 you've qualified. Or you can go to university for 3 years, get a degree, and then you go into a solicitor's office for 3 years. So most of us would prefer to do it the second way, though I had a theory that in fact the best solicitors were the ones who left school straight away and went into the office. So I went into to King's College for 3 years, and I left home and lived in London and made friends with people who I'm friendly with still today, and for the 3 years. And then at the end of the 3 years I went into a solicitor's office and used to work there every day until we took certain examinations. There were 2 lots of exams. There were exams for the degree, for the university degree, and there were exams to qualify as a solicitor. And there were some people who would take the degree and would want to become a barrister. You remember in England you've got these 2 different types of lawyer, barristers and solicitors.
It's like an advocate and a lawyer.
In a way, but the thing is the barristers aren't always just advocates, they're often more specialist. The solicitor was rather like the GP, as opposed to the consultant. You don't have consultants here, do you? Just have doctors.
And you happy with your choice that you went into law?
I don't know. Difficult to know, isn't it? Difficult to know. And I got where I am, whether it's good or it's bad, and that's what I did. And I couldn't think of anything else anyway, so it doesn't matter. Once I thought I'd like to do teaching, and then I realised you couldn't earn enough money, so we stopped that idea. That was the end of that idea.
And when you were at university, was being Jewish an issue ever, or did you ever have any incidents or?
Not really. No, nothing like they've got now. No. Nothing like they've got now, no. There was the only thing, when I was at university, of course, when was that? That was, I remember Suez.
It was in
I remember Suez.
In 56.
I was in 56, that was when I was at university. And I remember going to Trafalgar Square and seeing a Labour Party campaign against Israel. And that was the first time I'd come across anything like that. And the person leading it was Hugh Gaitskell. And he was leading this campaign. And I couldn't believe it, how Israel could be suffering so much opposition. So I remember that very clearly. And then after that there was a time, because years later other things happened and we realised that there was a certain amount of anti-Israel behaviour, and you don't really want me to go on with the later years. We did a great deal, Avril and I, because after the Yom Kippur War we became concerned about what was happening with anti-Zionism amongst students, Jewish students. So we formed a little organisation we called Israel Action, and we gradually enrolled people to help in it. And we used to train people so that when the students were confronted by anti-Israel material in the universities, they were sort of reasonably better armed than they otherwise would have been. And we spent a great deal of time on this. Avra actually spent a lot of time on it as well. And there was a stage when we actually organised a series of, teach-ins. We organised teach-ins on how to deal with anti-Israel propaganda. That we spent a great deal of time on. And at the time we thought we were achieving a lot. Now I see what's happening now. I say we wasted our time.
No, I'm sure it influenced a lot of people. How did you meet Avril?
Sorry?
How did you meet Avril?
Oh, well, that's quite an interesting story. I had a girlfriend who I was very keen on. I'd been out with for some time. And as I reached the age of 21, she suddenly turned around and she broke it off. She broke off the relationship. Not nastily, she just broke it off. So, she decided against. And a few years after that, some friends of mine was telling me about a Jewish musical evening, one of these sort of Jewish society things in somebody's house. And I knew that this person who was running it was a friend of this girl. So I thought, I'll go along, you never know. I might be able to revitalise it. And when I was there, I'll tell you who was there. Shirley was there. And Avril was there. And I was there with my friend John Rosen. And John Rosen had a car. And Shirley then spoke to John Rosen and said, can you give my friend a lift, Avril? So I went in the car with Avril with a lift. And I can't remember, I got her information, but I didn't do much with it. And then some considerable time later, I had some friends in on a Sunday afternoon. This was after I was qualified. Friends on a Sunday afternoon, and I thought, I'll phone her. And I phoned her and she came.
And the rest is history.
And that was it, that was it.
Wow.
So that's how it happened. And the funny thing about it is that about 3 or 4 years ago, we were in Malta, and a young woman came up to Avril and spoke to her. And it turned out this was that girl.
Wow.
She knew Avril. So Avril decided, how can I make sure this doesn't happen, nothing happens here? So she invited her for tea. And we've never seen her since.
Wow. But the encounter, it was a pleasant encounter.
Yes, yeah. That was how we met. So what else can I tell you? I can tell you about my relationship with Rabbi Dr. Jonathan Sachs.
It would be wonderful. If you could we're just going to show...
Yes. Right. I'll tell you about this photograph. This is a photograph of a crowd at a football match in Southend in 1924. And in the front row there is my father's mother and his 2 brothers and my father.
Where's your father?
My father is, where are we? There. And you'll notice that all the men have their heads covered.
They're wearing caps. It's amazing.
Because that's what happened in those days.
And they're wearing ties, they're very smart.
And ties, yes, absolutely.
This is such an amazing picture. And this is at a football game.
Yeah. So you see, it was in the family, football.
And there are quite a few ladies at the game as well.
Yeah, quite right. Not many though. Now there are far more women there. Like, you want this one now, do you? Okay, let me tell you the story. This is one of my father's shops. And standing in front of it are my father and my mother.
I'm just going to... What type of shop did they have?
Corsetry.
And this was in Brighton?
This one is in... No, this one was in East Croydon.
But they had in Brighton as well?
Had one in Brighton, and also one in Brixton.
And in Croydon as well?
Yeah. But I'll tell you the story behind it. The story behind it is that during the war, he was really a tailor. He was a tailor. He came from, from Poland, from Osikov near Lodz. They were all tailors. He was a tailor. So during the war, he invented an idea that was that if people would bring ladies' costumes, because there was cloth rationing. You couldn't buy cloth. It was rationed. You couldn't just go off and buy any suit or anything like that. Anyway, you couldn't buy a suit then because there were hardly any ready-made suits. Suits were made by tailors. So he converted ladies' costumes into men's suits. And that was a very successful business during the war. And then I think it was in 1948, there was a piece of terrible news on the radio, and that was that clothes rationing would come to an end. And once clothes rationing came to an end, that was the end of that sort of business. So he had to decide, what do I do about this? And for a time, I remember, there was no money coming in. And then he had an idea. He had a niece who worked as a sales girl in a shop in Brighton selling corsetry. He had the premises in East Croydon, the shop, but he wasn't doing anything with it. So he asked her to give him a list of all the different suppliers in that shop. And having got that list, he then proceeded to communicate with all the different suppliers to see if he could get them to supply him with those products. And he worked, and it worked. So he then turned his business from a tailoring business into a corsetry business. He did it together with his brother, whose real name was David, but we always called George, not sure why, how that happened. And it worked successfully until he died. And in fact, the shop in Croydon was rented from the local authority. And there came a time when the local authority decided they wanted to demolish it and do a rebuilding project. And I was a lawyer, I was a solicitor then. And I then played every game I could to hold the thing up. And I held it up and held it up and held it up until eventually there came a date at which he knew by that time he would have to give up. I think it was about give up. And 4 days before that, he was 88, by the way, but 4 days before that, Avril was in her kitchen, where we were living in London at the time, because we lived in London for years, and she got a phone call from him that he was feeling ill. So she got in the car and drove down from where we lived in the middle of London to East Croydon, which was probably something like a 45-minute drive. When she got there, she called an ambulance, and it turned out he'd had some sort of heart problem, and he was taken into hospital. And that was the end of the business. And the theory was that it happened to him because he was so upset the business was finishing, but it was tied in.
But he worked till 88?
Yeah.
Till he was... And today you don't have these shops anymore.
No, they're all gone,
It's
finished, all finished. But that was, they were let, and whatever it was just disappeared. And I remember saying to him, you know, you should try and do self-service. And he said, no, it'll never work with these products. And he was wrong. Because now it's self-service all the time, that sort of thing. People go into the big stores and just choose what they want.
Wow. And your relation with the late Rabbi Sachs?
Oh, well, let me just see how I can explain it.
He's very sorely missed.
I can't remember when it was. Louis Jacobs. This was before Jonathan Sachs was the chief rabbi. Louis Jacobs produced a book called A Tree of Life, which is a book about the flexibility of halakha, and he traces how things have changed all the way through. And then in his final chapter, he talks about a non-fundamentalist approach to halakha. And after the book came out, there was a review in the Jewish Chronicle by Jonathan Sachs. And I remember we used to get the Jewish Chronicle every Friday morning, and I'd go to the front door, pick up the Jewish Chronicle with the Times, and take it up to the bed and read it. And there was a review by Jonathan Sachs, which I thought was thoroughly dishonest. I called it panned with faint praise. In other words, he made a number of points which I thought were completely invalid. So he praised it in a way, but he was really saying, don't believe this. Now, so I got aggravated by that. And what did I do? So I wrote him a letter. And I complimented him on all the good things that he did, his approach, but questioned him on exactly what he meant. I questioned him in detail on what he meant, as a lawyer would ask. I requested further and better particulars of what he was really thinking.
And this was a private letter?
Sorry?
This was a private letter?
Private letter, yes. And I didn't get a reply, so I wrote again. And then eventually I got a reply. And he said, your historical questions are misconceived, because I said, where did it all come from, when, and so on. And is there a document, and who wrote the document? So he wrote and said, your historical questions are misconceived. He said, Torah min hashamayim is a metaphysical proposition. In other words, when he says in his interviews, it's the unmediated word of God, he doesn't mean that. It means it's a metaphysical proposition. So, as a result of that, I kept the letter, and I've never published it. I don't think it'd be the right thing to do. And I sent a copy to Louis Jacobs. And he said, I don't know what he's talking about. That was my experience with him. Since then, actually, I met him. I met him not long before we came to Israel. We came to Israel in 2019, and I met him in shul, in one of the shuls, and I was asking about something, and he was telling me about a particular author who he said had written a marvellous piece which was completely destroying biblical criticism. And in fact, I subsequently was, and that's what he said, called Joshua Berman. And Joshua Berman has written a book called Ani Ma'amin, which I've now read, in which he argues that we know that God must have dictated the Torah because the messages are so important. It was so revolutionary. Well, that doesn't prove anything. It just proves that the ideas are revolutionary. It doesn't prove who wrote it. So I reckon that this statement from Jonathan Sachs, who's done a lot of enormously good work, but on this particular field, I think he was playing around, because his problem was he was worried that the people on the right didn't want to hear what I think the reality is, so he wanted to cover it up. And I think once he retired, he went around the world. I think his general attitude was very different. So anyway, I've got this statement of his in Metaphysical Proposition. That was my involvement with him.
And have you read any of his other books?
I've read a lot of his books, yes. His earlier books I've read. I've read Covenant and Crisis, which actually deals with the idea of Torah min hashamayim and what it really is. and I think he sits on the fence and doesn't really answer the question. I've read a very interesting paper he wrote at a conference in America on autonomy, rabbinic autonomy, rabbis and autonomy. Who's got the authority to make decisions, and various of his books. The interesting book that I have read, of course, is Dignity of Difference. Yeah. Now, Dignity of Difference was a book which he wrote, trying to appeal to all the different religions. The idea was a very good one. And in this book, he wrote a statement that God speaks to Jews through Judaism and to Christians through Christianity. I don't know if you know about this. He was summoned to see the rabbis in Manchester.
That's right, yeah.
And once he saw them, he agreed that he'd bring out a new edition and would rephrase that paragraph.
But I must add on that
I think actually the rabbis were right.
But
I don't know how, as an Orthodox rabbi, you can say that Christianity is so valid that God speaks through it. So, you can say he speaks to Christians, but not through Christianity.
So what happened is he had a lot of support which said, "You, the chief rabbi, you don't need to listen to the rabbis."
That's right.
And he did listen, and he took their opinions, and he revised the book.
Yes, I know.
Which showed a lot of humility on his side.
Well, I wouldn't call it humility. I would put it the other way around. I would say it showed that he wasn't able to stand up. You see, the criticism of Louis Jacobs is that when he was asked to retract what he said, "I can't do that. That's what I think." If Louis Jacobs had just said, "Well, all right, okay, I don't really mean that," then maybe he would have been chief rabbi in due course. But he wouldn't do it. I think it was a case of integrity. I mean, I think that Jonathan Sacks, since he retired, did an enormous job all over the place, writing an enormous amount of material and speaking all over the place and creating a very good impression indeed. But I think on these particular things, I think he fell down.
But he had, as the chief rabbi, he had tremendous connections with the Archbishop of Canterbury.
I know.
With the royal family.
That was why he wrote what he wrote, because he felt he wanted to write something they would like to hear, which is reasonable. But I think having written it, well, he knew that his position was at stake. I think that probably was it. That once the rabbis who were questioning him, were attacking him, in fact, were demanding something, he would find himself in an impossible position if he refused to do what they wanted. That's my feeling. You see, Louis Jacobs wasn't the chief rabbi then, so he didn't have to worry about it. So he could just do what he wanted.
I see it different. I see it that he listened to different viewpoints and he made his decision.
Yeah.
We had a lot of people that said that you don't even need to go and meet the chief rabbi, and what made you and Avril decide to come to Israel? Did you come
well,
from
there was a B'nai Akiva. I was always, the idea was, we were brainwashed into Israel, if you like. And when these different events happened, like the Six-Day War, Suez, the Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, we always felt very deeply as a result of how we'd grown up. And we always really wanted to, and once we used to come here frequently. One stage, I was thinking of coming here and qualifying as a lawyer, and I was put off by my friend who came here as is now a retired doctor, consultant, lives in Haifa, and he said to me, "I warn you, if you come here as a lawyer, they'll eat you up." And Avril then got worried. She thought, we can come here, we just can't make a living, so we didn't come. And in the end, I think we just left it much too late. I didn't realise until I looked back recently how old I was when I came.
Well, thank God you're here. And
yeah.
Are you happy that you made the move, that you came to Israel?
I'm happy that I made the move. I'm very happy about unhappy about what's going on here. Forget what's going on in America and in Britain, but what's going on here, I'm very disturbed about. Ever since that government started operating, I got worried, and every time another thing happened, I got more and more worried. And I'm very disturbed, and it's still going on. And that judicial reform business, it's still going on. They're still manoeuvring to achieve what they want to achieve. Whether they'll succeed or not, I don't know. I hope not. But they're still trying.
It caused tremendous division Tremendous division.
Well, it was. It was in the Supreme Court hearing. The government lawyer suggested that the Declaration of Independence was of no importance. It was just incredible. I mean, it sets out very basic principles upon which the state has been set up. And we have got all these problems because we know that whatever attempts have been made to organise peace have fallen flat, and the other side have always have never responded in a way that's been make it possible. So we don't know really what the answer is. But I still think, it worries me what's going on here. I have to say, I don't think you can actually blame Netanyahu for the fact that the intelligence people were asleep on October the 7th. What they blame him for is the fact that he created a situation in which that could arise.
Yeah.
But he can't be blamed for that actual event, my opinion. You going out?
Finished.
Yeah.
No. I haven't finished all my opinions.
Charles is just going to give a message. Which message would you like to give? Because it's so important to hear.
My message is I would say this, that I am very deeply concerned and hope that in fact there will be an election soon, and there will be in Israel a government which actually is ruling for all the people, and that we can actually work in a way that the different factions will stop fighting each other. That's my view. How it will happen I just don't know, because they say, don't they, that the trouble in Israel is there are 3 different tribes, and the tribes won't give in to each other.
But it's a hopeful view,
Yeah.
and it's, I think, a view that many share. Charles, I just want to thank you. This has been really...
You're
so
coming here
very
now to
special.
talk with me.
I just want to thank you personally.
Do you have a message?
So I just want to thank you, and it always is a pleasure to hear you, and it's a pleasure to hear that, not only did you have your views, but you went to protest, and you feel part of the country, and you hear, and you...
And my important thing now, my job now is, I see, I've seen actually over the years, my granddaughters used to come to me on every week or so when I was here. They're both married now. One of them's married now, the other is almost married now. And we used to go through a bit of Judaism, and particularly, the sorts of things I've just been talking about. And we have a grandson who's 18 and is at yeshiva at the moment, and he comes to me from time to time, and I want to teach him something about what religious Zionism is really about. And I'm going to discuss with him Rav Shagar. And Rav Shagar was one of the great rabbis who was seriously injured in the Yom Kippur War, and then wrote a lot of philosophical works. And he explained what religious Zionism is about, and that's what I'd like my grandson to learn, because I think the religious Zionism that is being promoted today is not the religious Zionism we grew up with.
Well, you should just be well, and maybe stream in good health and nachas from your dear family. Thank you so much.
There's a particular famous painting by Rembrandt, which I admire greatly. It's called Jeremiah Lamenting the Destruction of Jerusalem. And a long time ago, I had a little postcard of it, and then more recently I got a print when we were living in England. And we used to hang this print near our front door hallway. And one night, Friday night, there was a terrific crash. It was probably about 2 o'clock in the morning. We didn't know what it was, and we rushed out into the hallway to see what had happened. We thought we'd had a burglary, and we found this picture had fallen to the ground and the glass had smashed. This was Friday night. Motzei Shabbat, I got a telephone call from my friend Michael Alpert, and he said, I thought I should tell you that Rabbi Jacobs passed away yesterday. And we sometimes say, was there any connection between the two?
We have this very beautiful menorah.
Where do you want me to stand?
Sure.
Do you want anybody else in it?
This is so how did you obtain this magnificent menorah?
Well, that was it. So it was given as a present. After he died, the family brought it round for us.
Because you did a lot of pro bono.
I did some work for them, yes. Not probate, no. I did work during his lifetime to do with where he was living and so on, legal documents.
And this is a show of appreciation.
That's right.
It's wonderful.
I'm still in touch with them.
Charles, thank you so very much.